Olivia Hayes stood in the center of the grand ballroom, the heavy silk of her wedding gown a suffocating weight, the air thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken disappointment. She was supposed to be radiant, the very picture of a bride in the historic, ivy-covered Chicago club. But the space beside her mother, the chair conspicuously empty near the head table, drew her eye like a physical ache. It wasn't just an empty chair. It was the summation of 29 years of second-place finishes. Her father, James Hayes, CEO of Hayes Global Logistics, hadn't just missed the wedding. He hadn't forgotten the date, nor was he delayed by a sudden emergency flight. No. He had sent a crisp, 3-line email from his office in Boston, 48 hours prior, stating only that a critical, non-negotiable Q3 strategy session required his presence. He was sorry, of course. A check had been wired. Congratulations. Olivia had read the email in her old bedroom, the room she'd grown up in outside Portland, Oregon, a room that always felt temporary, just a stopover until the next board meeting called her father away. She hadn't cried immediately. The tears were long gone, wrung out by years of conditioning. Instead, a cold, hard stone of certainty settled deep in her chest. This was it. The final, definitive proof of her value, or lack thereof, in his ledger. James Hayes dealt in tonnage, quarterly earnings, and the immovable machinery of global supply chains. He had no capacity for the soft, messy variables of human connection, especially not for a daughter who hadn't chosen the family business. Her older brother, Marcus, had been the designated successor since he was old enough to operate a forklift on the dockyard floor. Marcus, who drove an identical black sedan to their father's, who spoke in the same clipped, efficient sentences, and who had received a monogrammed silver key to the corporate box at Fenway Park on his 18th birthday. For Olivia, there had been piano lessons she hated, art history classes he called frivolous, and an unwavering, quiet dismissal in his eyes. Her childhood memories were a series of fleeting images, his black leather briefcase resting precisely on the mahogany floor, the smell of his expensive, sterile cologne, the way he would nod without looking up when she showed him a stellar report card, already turning the page of the Wall Street Journal. "Find something stable, Liv," he'd told her once, years ago, when she mentioned her dream of creating something tactile, something beautiful. Art doesn't pay the rent. Logistics pays the rent. The reception played out in a haze of polite smiles and clinking champagne glasses. Her husband, Michael, kind and steady, squeezed her hand beneath the table, his eyes full of pity she couldn't stand. She saw Marcus across the room, already on his phone, looking bored, fulfilling his duty as the family's representative. That night, Olivia shed the silk gown, peeled off the mask of the happy bride, and stood looking at her reflection. She wasn't angry. Anger was messy, a loss of control. She was finished. She was through waiting for a love that would never materialize. The empty chair had gifted her a terrifying, powerful clarity. She was entirely, utterly free to choose her own ledger. The next morning, the day after her wedding, she walked into a co-working space in Seattle, signed the lease for a tiny, windowless office, and founded Hayes & Co., a deliberate, provocative nod to the name she was simultaneously shedding and reclaiming. She didn't choose logistics. She chose to build beauty. Her focus was on creating a nationwide network of high-end, holistic wellness centers, sanctuaries designed to combat the very burnout that had hardened her father's heart and consumed her own youth. She called them Ethel, Old English for noble. The first center was a failing gym in a forgotten corner of Austin, Texas. It was a disaster, mold in the locker rooms, broken equipment, a leaky roof. She bought it with every penny of her modest savings and a terrifying bank loan. The early years were a blur of concrete dust and exhaustion. There were no weekends, no holidays. She slept 4 hours a night on a makeshift cot in the back office, living on stale coffee and sheer spite. She learned drywall, plumbing, electrical codes. She hired, fired, begged, and borrowed. She needed to know every single aspect of her business from the ground up, not because James Hayes had taught her to, but because she refused to be caught unprepared. She needed to build an empire that, unlike his, could not be torn down by one man's ego. Her CFO, her rock, was Amelia Vance, a brilliant, cynical woman who'd left a high-powered finance job to join Olivia's madness. "We're hemorrhaging capital, Liv," Amelia would state every quarter, her voice flat, but her eyes full of steel. "This Austin location is a pit. You need to cut losses." "We hold," Olivia would reply, scrubbing grime from a marble countertop. "It's the foundation. We can't build a tower without the first block." The foundation, she knew, wasn't the building. It was the grit. It was her own unwillingness to fail, her terror of returning to the quiet disappointment of her childhood. 2 years in, the Austin Ethel finally broke even, then, miraculously, turned a profit. Its aesthetic, curated, minimalist design, state-of-the-art biofeedback equipment, a rare focus on quiet, unhurried service, hit a cultural nerve. The breakout moment came 3 years later, in Boston of all places. Olivia had acquired a stunning, century-old former library in a prime location. She poured everything into it, transforming the cavernous space into a breathtaking, light-filled haven. When the doors opened, the press was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Ethel wasn't a gym. It was a movement. Expansion became rapid, but controlled. She moved through the U.S., a sleek, high-tech conversion in a Chicago skyscraper, a peaceful, cedar-scented retreat overlooking the rugged coastline in Portland, Maine. Always the details, the hand-stitched linen, the precise temperature of the water, the quiet greeting at the door. Her father's business moved millions of tons of steel and grain. Her business moved people toward peace. 7 years after the empty chair, Olivia sat in the boardroom of the new Ethel headquarters in Manhattan, the city skyline spread out before her like a vanquished map. Amelia was beside her. The investment bank's lead analyst, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Kroll, cleared his throat. "The market is responding even better than our initial projections, Ms. Hayes," Kroll said, consulting his notes. "The intangible value of the brand equity is staggering. After factoring in the projected growth in the next 2 quarters and the imminent acquisition of the Denver and Miami portfolios, we feel confident valuing Ethel at, and please note, this is a conservative estimate, $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion. The number hung in the air, immense and impersonal. Olivia didn't gasp or smile broadly. She simply nodded once, a gesture her father would have approved of. It felt less like a triumph and more like a simple fact. A calculation finally completed. That evening, as she was reviewing the final draft of the valuation report, her phone rang. A private, unfamiliar number from Boston. She let it ring twice before answering. Olivia. The voice was instantly recognizable, deep, precise, and devoid of warmth. James Hayes. She paused, letting the silence stretch, a courtesy he had never extended to her. "Father, I saw the journal this morning. Congratulations on the valuation. Remarkable numbers." There was no pride, no joy, only acknowledgement, like noting a favorable weather report. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'd like to see you. There are things we need to discuss. Marcus and I are in New York next week. Dinner, Tuesday." The usual place, the usual place. The old money, heavy-curtained steakhouse in Midtown, a mausoleum of quiet power where she had sat through countless excruciating family meals. "I'm busy Tuesday," she said. It was a lie. She was holding the evening open, a deliberate blank space in her calendar. The pause on his end was one of pure shock, followed by a slight, brittle irritation. "Olivia, this isn't a social call. This is about business, family business." "Then you may send me a memo," she replied, her tone perfectly even. "But I can do Wednesday, 8 o'clock. My place, the downtown loft. Marcus, too, if he can spare the time away from his own impressive logistics empire. She heard a sharp intake of breath. He was being challenged, the established order broken. "Fine," he said, the single word weighted with cold resentment. "Wednesday, 8. He hung up without a proper goodbye. Olivia smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips. She looked at Amelia, who had witnessed the call. "He finally called," Amelia said, a ghost of pity in her voice. "No," Olivia corrected, her eyes still on the skyline. "The valuation called. I merely answered." The next few months were spent in a silent, methodical war room. James Hayes's supposed critical strategy sessions had been thinly veiled attempts to stave off a slow, systemic disaster. Hayes' global logistics, too centralized, too dependent on outdated supply chain technology, had been hemorrhaging cash for years. Marcus, it turned out, was a poor imitation of his father, lacking the cold genius required to pivot. Olivia and Amelia worked through layers of debt filings, offshore holdings, and private bank memos. The Hayes empire was not just failing. It was a hollow shell, leveraged to the hilt, held together by ancient, unsecured loans. The final, largest piece of the puzzle was an $80 million tranche of debt held by a German investment firm. A debt they were looking to offload for pennies on the dollar to secure a quarterly win. "We can't just buy his debt, Liv," Amelia had argued, hands thrown up. "It's insane. It'll tank our working capital." "We can," Olivia insisted, pushing the papers across the glass desk. "And we will. It's the final piece. The quiet kill. He will never see it coming, and he will never be able to trace it back. Set up 3 shell corporations, 2 in Nevis, 1 in Cyprus. Funnel the money through the Ethel private equity arm. I want it done before Wednesday." The dinner took place in Olivia's downtown Manhattan loft, a space that was the antithesis of the dark steakhouse. It was all glass, exposed concrete, and light, filled with the rare scent of clean air and quiet power. She had the dining table set with exquisite, simple Japanese ceramics, the chairs comfortable but sparse. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, impeccable, expensive, and utterly neutral. James and Marcus arrived precisely at 8. The tension was immediate, a heavy, unmoving object. Marcus looked uneasy, glancing at the $20,000 piece of minimalist art on the wall. James, however, was in his element, his eyes assessing the square footage, calculating the property value. "Impressive, Olivia," James said, his voice flat. "Expensive zip code. You've done well. Better than I expected from a wellness venture." "It's a good location," Olivia replied, placing a chilled glass of water before him. Marcus spoke first, nervous energy radiating off him. "Look, Liv, Dad and I wanted to talk about a potential partnership. Hayes Global has massive infrastructure, but we're looking to diversify into high-end corporate leasing. An Ethel-branded wellness wing in our industrial parks. Synergistic." It was a blatant, pathetic attempt to latch on to her success. "Synergy," Olivia repeated, taking her own seat. "A useful word. You mean you'd like to put your name on my hard work to shore up your shaky financials?" The air snapped. James Hayes's head lifted, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Watch your tone, Olivia. We are your family. We are trying to offer you an opportunity." "An opportunity I have already created for myself," she countered, leaning back slightly in her chair. "Tell me, Marcus, how is the Q4 debt servicing on the German bond coming along? The 80 million tranche, is it?" Marcus visibly froze, a look of pure, sickly fear flashing across his face. James Hayes's hand, which had been resting calmly on the table, curled into a fist. "That is highly confidential company data," James clipped out. "You have no right to that information." "Oh, but I do, Father," Olivia said softly, reaching into the inner pocket of her charcoal suit jacket. She pulled out a thin stack of papers, immaculate, legal-grade documents, tied with a single black paperclip. She slid them precisely onto the pristine white tablecloth, placing them directly between the two men. Before we discuss synergy, perhaps you should review these. James Hayes stared at the papers. He picked up the top sheet, his eyes scanning the corporate letterhead, the legal jargon, the familiar numbers, and the signature line at the bottom. His face, always controlled, always a mask of aloof certainty, began to crumble. The color drained, leaving the skin tight and ashen. He dropped the paper as if burned. "What is this?" he ground out, the words barely a whisper. Olivia lifted her chin. "Those are the documents of sale, Father. The transfer of ownership for all outstanding unsecured debt held by the German investment group, Krieger and Sona, plus the 5 smaller tranches held by the Cayman accounts. As of 4 p.m. yesterday, all $89 million of your company's toxic debt is no longer held by outside creditors." She paused, letting him absorb the staggering number, the impossible reality. "It is now held by a holding company named Ethel Family Fund I, LP, she finished, her voice calm as a tomb. "I am the sole controlling partner. James, Marcus, I own your debt. All of it." Marcus was stammering, his hands flapping in helpless confusion. You bought the bonds. Why? You can't—" James Hayes didn't stammer. He erupted. "You bitch," he roared, the sound shocking in the quiet, expensive room. He slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the fine ceramics. "You bought my company. You used my name, my money, to stab me in the back." His breathing was ragged, his face mottled with fury, the cold, composed businessman finally stripped bare. "You are nothing. You were always a distraction, a frivolous girl playing with yoga mats. I gave you everything. This is despicable, unforgivable." Olivia held his furious, unstable gaze, unblinking. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She was the eye of the storm. "You gave me a last name, Father." "That is all," she stated, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a tidal wave. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "I didn't buy your company to stab you in the back, James. I bought it to ensure it can never hurt me again. I bought the structure that made you who you are, the one that taught me I would never be enough. And I bought it so that no one, ever again, has the power to look me in the eye and tell me my efforts are not worthy of their time." She watched the rage in his eyes shift, briefly, into a terrible, devastating comprehension. "7 years ago," she continued, her voice gaining a sharp, precise edge, "I stood in a white dress, waiting. I'd spent my entire life hoping that that moment, the biggest day of my life, would finally be the one thing important enough to merit your attention. But you sent an email, a 3-line rejection. You chose a quarterly strategy session over your own daughter." Her voice broke only on the word daughter, a tiny final concession to the pain. "That moment was the end of my life as Olivia Hayes, your disappointed second-born," she whispered. "The next morning, I began the life of the woman who would one day be able to buy your logistics strategy session, your priorities, and your cold, calculating silence." She rose slowly, regally, the movement deliberate. "Hayes Global is now under the control of my fund. I will allow you and Marcus to remain on as highly paid, non-voting, non-executive board members, only because I believe in professional continuity. You will report to a CEO appointed by me. You will, for the first time in your lives, simply follow orders and watch a company be run with vision, not spite." She smoothed the front of her jacket, a final calming gesture. "Dinner is concluded. I have an early flight to Denver tomorrow. Amelia will be in touch with the terms of your continued employment. Good evening, Father." "Marcus." She turned, not running, not hurrying, but walking with an unshakable dignity toward the large glass window, leaving the two men alone in the white, sterile silence of the loft. She didn't look back. The next morning, on the flight to Denver, Olivia looked out at the clouds, vast, clean, and endless. The crushing weight was gone. The immense, impossible task was done. The victory was not in the number, not in the $1.8 billion, but in the final, definitive cutting of the cord. She had not destroyed him. She had saved herself. Over the next year, Hayes Global Logistics, now fully modernized, became a profitable, efficient arm of the Ethel infrastructure, quietly moving supplies, equipment, and resources for the growing empire. The toxic properties of the old debt were cleansed. Olivia walked the finished halls of the Portland, Maine Ethel, the reclaimed space now smelling of sandalwood and fresh sea air. The sun streamed through the vaulted ceilings, warming the ancient, beautiful stone. She wasn't building for revenge anymore. She was building for peace. She had spent years constructing a life designed to prove a negative, that she was not the failure her father had dismissed. Now, she was finally building for a positive. She was building for the woman she was, not the girl who had been hurt. The money, the power, the immense empire, they were simply the solid, immovable foundation she had always craved, a foundation she could finally trust. She realized, looking out at the calm ocean, that the ultimate revenge wasn't in winning the game he played. It was in realizing that the only competition that ever truly mattered was the one she had won against her own fear. The empty chair at the wedding had not been an absence. It had been an invitation. A harsh, cruel invitation to leave the past behind, step into the light, and choose yourself, fully and completely, every single time.